Everything's falling into place for Atari, until it vanishes. It's NES Works Gaiden episode something or another.
Can you do it?
Does Tina Turner wear a wig?
That's a wig?
I mentioned a few episodes ago on NES Works that Atari had been conspiring in the background to break Nintendo's monopoly on its own console and publish for Nintendo Entertainment System without Nintendo's approval. We see that effort come to fruition here, with the first NES release of Soviet computer mega hit Tetris.
But first, it's worth taking a side excursion to Japan. 1989 was the year of living dangerously, thanks to Tetris. And because real life doesn't care about calendars, that dangerous year actually began in late 1988 with the bulletproof software Famicom release of Tetris. This cartridge makes for an unlikely beginning for the saga of Tetris and Nintendo. The NES and especially Game Boy versions of Tetris helped sell those systems while simultaneously propelling the game from critical darling of the home computer literati to a global icon. And yet this version, programmed and published not by Nintendo, but rather by Hank Rogers' bulletproof software, doesn't present Tetris in a way that screams all-time beloved classic creation. Remarkably, despite all evidence to the contrary, BPS Tetris proves that it is possible to make even this masterpiece of a game kind of tedious and unenjoyable. The basics work the same, of course. This is Tetris, and that comes with certain fixed rules. As anyone who has dared to introduce new pieces into the mix has learned, to their immediate regret, players control the descent of differently shaped blocks into a well. These pile up as they reach the bottom, falling into place and becoming fixed, unless, that is, the player should happen to cause them to land in such a way that the fixed blocks span the width of the entire well. When you complete a line in this manner, all the debris on that line vanishes, causing the pile to drop accordingly and giving you more space for maneuvering the pieces above. You can clear away up to 4 lines at a time, with the number of points you earn increasing significantly with each additional line you remove due to the greater complexity and risk involved. Clearing a single line takes almost no planning whatsoever. A double clear is nearly as easy, as the shapes of the falling pieces tend to slot into 2 line spaces easily. Triples, however, require some careful consideration, especially given that only 3 of the 7 pieces can even create a triple clear. You have to build your pile deliberately, leaving only a single column of empty space available for one of those pieces to arrive in the mix. As for the quadruple clear, the eponymous Tetris, well, that takes even more doing. Only one piece can even make that happen. The so-called eyepiece, or the hero, as it absolutely is not officially called in any version of the game ever. And setting up for a Tetris forces you to leave a single 4-row column of bricks open, while taking care not to accidentally block it off with the pieces that fall above it as you wait for an eyepiece to arrive. This constitutes very nearly the entirety of Tetris's gameplay. Designer Alexei Pechetnov created a work of stark simplicity. Unsurprisingly, given the fact that his tool for the project was a woefully dated, shared computer system with no graphical capabilities. And Tetris draws its strength from giving you a playground filled with 7 shapes and throwing those objects at you faster and faster until you can no longer keep up. The BPS release reproduces Pechetnov's original game competently enough, but it betrays the fact that the BPS team cut their teeth on 1980s home computers as well, where the idea of friendly game design and visual refinement tended to be less important than simply making a program run at all. If you compare this version to the more refined 8-bit Tetris games that came along the following year, or heck, even Atari's contemporaneous arcade release, it just feels off. I mean, at least it didn't have the horrible, distracting static background of Mirrorsoft's Amiga version, but that's about all BPS Tetris has going for it. Let's start by addressing the greatest crime against the modern Tetris-trained brain here: the controls. Unlike literally any other version of Tetris I've ever played, BPS Tetris uses a strange control configuration in which the A button drops a piece instantly, and the D-pad rotates that piece. I can almost understand the thinking here. You rotate the pieces, so naturally you'd want to press the D-pad in the direction that they need to turn. It makes sense. Or it would if you didn't need the D-pad to control the lateral movement of the pieces as well. So rather than pressing right or left to rotate a piece clockwise or counterclockwise, you press, which doesn't feel natural. And the A button drop is fine once you retrain your mind for it, I guess, but this version takes a very binary approach to block dropping. Blocks either descend at their own speed, or you hit A to perform a hard drop, which instantly sends the current block to the bottom of the well. There is no option for a controlled hard drop as in later versions of the game, meaning that at the lower levels of play, you either force blocks to fall instantly into whichever spot happens to be directly below, or else you need to spend time waiting for a piece to make its way to the bottom at its own pace. A simple hard drop works perfectly well in most cases, but not always. Sometimes you want to slip a piece laterally beneath an unfortunate overhang in order to fill up blocks that would otherwise create a gap, and BPS Tetris makes that difficult. Also strange, BPS Tetris gives players lives. You can fail 3 times before you see a game over screen, rather than the game simply ending once the block stack hits the kill line at the top of the screen. That's weird. It's perfectly reasonable to point to personal computers as the source of the awkwardness found in this version. BPS produced a whole load of home versions of Tetris for the Japanese market at the end of 1988, meaning that the Famicom cartridge was simply one of 8 different versions released in the span of a few months. BPS built the Famicom game around the visuals and mechanics of the home computer versions, and my guess is that the relative limitations of the platform made this a relatively unloved project. When your lead platforms are the likes of the PC-98 and X68000, which offered high-resolution graphics, tons of memory capacity, and advanced audio capabilities, the aging Famicom hardware seems like the kind of project a programmer would land as punishment for a lousy annual review. This version of Tetris has, understandably, gone almost completely unknown in the West. It doesn't even seem to be that popular in Japan. Certainly this version of Tetris makes for an awkward introduction to the game for Japan's console enthusiasts, who, at the end of 1988, were still almost entirely focused on Famicom. But here in America, our console introduction to Tetris proved to be just as wonky, but for entirely different reasons. You see, NES fans received their introduction to Tetris courtesy of Tengen. You remember Tengen, right? A division of Nintendo rival Atari, Tengen had published 4 NES games under license in the latter half of 1988. Ports of Namco's Pac-Man and Family Stadium as RBI Baseball, and conversions of Atari games Gauntlet and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. However, as I've mentioned before, these releases do not appear on Nintendo's official NES games list nowadays, because Nintendo has scrubbed all mention of Tengen from its public-facing messaging. As far as Nintendo is concerned, Tengen was never a licensee, and any copy of Gauntlet you may happen to find for NES bearing the Nintendo seal of quality is clearly some sort of psyop designed to inveigle easily impressionable children. That's because at the end of 1988, Tengen went rogue, and they made their debut here as criminals by bringing home a totally new take on Tetris, whether Nintendo liked it or not. This made a lot of people very angry and has widely been regarded as a bad move. It should have been a great move, though. Now Tengen, being a division of Atari Corp., had no legal connection to Atari Games, a wholly separate arcade-focused entity from the home computer and console business that spawned Tengen. However, the two companies seemed to maintain a close relationship when it came to the NES, with plenty of Atari Games creations showing up under the Tengen label through the years. And Atari Games had landed the US rights to produce an arcade version of, you guessed it, Tetris. Those rights fell to Sega in Japan, a fact that ended up creating a wholly different legal mess that I'll probably have to touch on at some point in Gaiden. Here though, the Atari Games Tetris connection looked like an absolute coup for Tengen. If the company could have chosen any game to kick off its post-divorce lifestyle from Nintendo, could there have been any release more compelling than an addicting puzzle game that had been gaining notoriety and fame in magazines and through word of mouth? Even before the Game Boy version arrived, Tetris was clearly about to explode in popularity in the West. Even putting aside the Soviet mind game angle, a connotation which had become intriguing rather than intimidating thanks to Mikhail Gorbachev's Glasnost initiative and the incipient, symbolic fall of the Berlin Wall, Tetris was a great game that had begun grabbing headlines. And Nintendo fans would only be able to buy it as an unauthorized cartridge from Tengen. This was a real middle finger to Nintendo, a licensing coup with the potential to shift the balance of power in the American console space and give a US-owned corporation a leg up on the Japanese interlopers that had swept in to take advantage of the vacuum left by the collapse that split Atari into 2 entities. Unfortunately, Atari and Tengen didn't count on Nintendo's lawyers doing a Boris Yeltsin and derailing their coup before it even began in earnest. But that's getting ahead of history here. In May 1989, Tengen launched Tetris to retail. It was the first American NES game to appear without the Nintendo seal of quality, without Nintendo branding, and without a Nintendo manufactured cartridge. Tengen manufactured its own ROMs and carts, shipping games in distinct black shells with a sloped upper side and scaled-up game manuals. And sending this new format into the world with Tetris as its envoy made a strong statement. Tengen had no need for Nintendo. They could go it alone. The historic parallels just don't stop, really. The Atari team-up required to bring the arcade version of Tetris to NES ironically echoed the turn of events that caused those two businesses to spin out of Atari Inc. 5 years earlier. Atari star programmers had formed third-party developer and publisher Activision in order to enjoy more creative and financial control over their work for the Atari 2600. Atari fought back, but ultimately the courts ruled in Activision's favor, opening the floodgates to an unruly mob of third parties whose incredibly variable work quality and glut of releases drowned the 2600 at retail and helped initiate a crisis that sent the US console industry into a tailspin that only ended when Nintendo stepped in and distributed the Famicom here as the NES. And now we have the children of Atari attempting to achieve something similar in Nintendo's domain. You have to admire the sheer audacity of exploiting your own fatal weakness against a rival, you know? And that is why this Tetris retrospective is NES Gaiden. Tengen Tetris is not an authorized NES release. But in some ways, it's a superior game to the one that Nintendo would publish later in 1989. Tengen's Tetris looks a bit plain by comparison to the shiny, candy-colored pieces of Nintendo's release, but it offers an impressive feature set that demonstrates a very conscientious effort by Tengen's programmers to address the needs and desires of the home console space in a way that the BPS game didn't. Fundamentally, Tengen Tetris looks and works the same as Atari's Tetris arcade game, similar to the way BPS Tetris for Famicom looked and worked like that company's computer releases. The NES game incorporates some aesthetic changes to accommodate the limitations of the console hardware, of course. For example, each piece has a distinct color coding to help players more quickly identify the pieces at higher play level, which is the origin of the Orange Ricky hoax. But unlike in the arcade game, pieces don't retain their color once they've dropped. Instead, everything that lands in the well shifts to a single color, making for a more somber-looking field of play than in many other versions, including Atari's. Similarly, the well itself abandons the onion dome-like center column design that the arcade game used to reinforce the whole "Hey kids, Soviet mind games" marketing angle. In its place is a simple block that reads Tetris, or rather, kind of reads Tetris, but not really, with a botched pigeon form of Cyrillic. It's not a good-looking game, and the music makes these recreations of traditional Russian tunes sound awfully tinny. But it plays beautifully. Unlike BPS Tetris, Tengen Tetris works more like the game we've all come to know and love through the years. The D-pad moves the active block laterally across the well, but also allows you to press down for controlled hard drops. The A and B buttons rotate pieces clockwise. Although you'll spot some differences from modern mandatory rule sets, you can forget about infinite spin, it's a comfortable, familiar interpretation of the game compared to the gaslighting of Japan's BPS release. And best of all, Tetris by Tengen offers a wealth of play modes, a total of 5 different play approaches. I mentioned the central column that kinda sorta reads Tetris. Well, that column exists because this version of Tetris plays out entirely through a dual field setup. When you play a solo game, you play in the leftmost well, and the right side of the screen tracks the relative number of different pieces that have dropped over the course of the game. Solo play works just fine. You can choose your starting speed and the height of block crud that already clogs the playing well at the start, effectively defining your difficulty level. As in nearly every version of Tetris ever produced, the level at which you play determines the speed at which the blocks descend. The higher the level, the faster they fall, and you jump a level to a faster speed after every 30 lines you clear. However, solo play is the only time you'll see that right column stat tracking. In the other 4 modes, the right well belongs to the second player. The second player can be another human or the computer, but either way, Tengen Tetris allows you to treat Tetris as a competition. Unless I'm misreading the exhaustively detailed Tetris wiki, this marks the first time head-to-head play featured in any commercial version of Tetris. Of course, head-to-head play would be a major selling point of Tetris for Game Boy, but Tengen beat the Japanese release of that version to market by a month. And if we're being totally honest here, you can tell that this is an early attempt at Tetris multiplayer. It lacks any sort of Puyo-style attack mechanic to send garbage over to the other player's side. When you face off against a competitor, whether real or virtual, you effectively played 2 independent games of Tetris that just happen to share the same block spawn pattern on a single screen. When one player succumbs to the inevitable, They sit at a game over screen while their rival just keeps on playing. You can start a fresh game to continue playing from the start if you like, and the game will track multiple high scores per session, but there's no real competitive element here besides comparing who has the larger score when all is said and done. More interesting is the cooperative mode, in which two players receive and control separate pieces simultaneously, competing in a single well. Although the game refers to this mode as cooperative, it really only plays cooperatively in the same sense that games like Joust and Mario Bros. Are cooperative, but actually about opportunistically screwing over the other person when it suits your advantage. Technically, you want to pursue the same goal here, preventing garbage from reaching the kill line, but the game tracks scores for each player based on their individual actions. So this mode quickly degenerates into pure cutthroat warfare as you try to set up opportunities to make meaningful line clears while preventing the other player from sniping them from beneath you and racking up the multi-line multipliers that you've so painstakingly set up. The multiplayer mechanics here are fairly rudimentary, but as I said, they still give Tengen Tetris more replay value than the aesthetically superior Nintendo release that would appear later in '89. Not that players had the opportunity to weigh the relative advantages and weaknesses of the two versions, because Tengen's cunning move into unlicensed territory turned out to be a huge tactical error. In fact, you can spot so many own goals here that it's hard to know which turned out to be more disastrous for Tengen. On one hand, Tengen didn't exactly go about breaking Nintendo's hammerlock on NES publishing within the bounds of the law. Rather than reverse engineering the console's infamous 10 NES security chip and coming up with a clean room solution for evading the lockout tech, Tengen cheated. From what I understand, their version of Tetris and subsequent releases only worked on NES because their engineers scoured some first-party technical documents that they acquired in the course of falsified legal proceedings and used Nintendo's own internal data to come up with a security workaround. This was, to put it in the most technical legal terms, a no-no. Had Tengen managed to engineer a solution on their own, they could have opened the door to unrestricted NES publishing and potentially made a pile of loot just by licensing their anti-security chip to other third parties. But since they used Nintendo's own code acquired under false pretenses, Nintendo's increasingly aggressive legal team eagerly took them to court the moment their first unlicensed cartridge appeared, powered by stolen info. Although the American legal system wouldn't fully resolve this case for 5 years, it kept Tengen tied up, devoured their profits, and helped make American retailers hesitant to stop Tengen titles. Of course, Nintendo would fall afoul of the law itself, thanks to the strong-arm tactics it used to prevent unlicensed games from appearing at American retail. No one really comes out of this story looking like a hero. But the double whammy of Tengen Tetris was that Tengen also lacked the legal right to publish the game. In this case, Tengen didn't do any sneaking around on its own accord, but rather found themselves the victim of someone else's malfeasance. And even that was more of a comedy of errors and misunderstandings than deliberate shenanigans. The publishing rights to Tetris turned out to be an absolute disaster due to those Soviet origins the marketing taglines loved to bandy about. This was no one's fault in particular, simply a compatibility issue between Western capitalism and Soviet socialism. Tetris designer Pajitnov created Tetris before Glasnost and Perestroika under the employ of a government-run university on government-owned equipment. By every social and legal measure, the game belonged to the Soviet Union. But once the USSR began to open up trade with Europe and America, the government had to figure out things like how licensing and property rights even worked. This, and presumably differences in language and cultural assumptions, led to a load of confusion when it came to the various rights associated with Tetris. The logistics have been covered in exhaustive detail through the years by more scholarly writers than myself, and I recommend the gaming historian's Tetris documentary for more. But the short of it is that certain people assumed they had the rights to specific versions of Tetris that had not in fact been ceded to them. Those parties sub-licensed the game to Atari and Tengen, but while those arcade rights were in the clear, the console rights didn't actually fall under the original agreement. This allowed Bulletproof boss Hank Rogers to slip in and broker legitimate arrangements between the Soviet licensor, Elektron Norg Technica, and Nintendo. The concept of ambiguous rights across different platforms was nothing new for Nintendo, who had already dealt with a similar sort of confusion years before with their Donkey Kong licensing agreement with the Coleco. In this case, though, Nintendo weaponized the legal missteps to use against their potential rival. Between Tengen's 10 NES copyright violations and the fact that they didn't actually have the legal right to publish Tetris as a console cartridge, Nintendo forced Tengen to pull the game off shelves within weeks of its release. As an unlicensed publisher, Tengen already had to work with a relatively small pool of retailers. But this turn of events pulled the rug from beneath their feet, forcing them to recall the hundreds of thousands of cartridges they had manufactured at considerable cost as their understandably optimistic initial foray into self-publishing. This made Tengen Tetris the first NES release to become a highly sought-after collector's piece that commanded a premium price on the aftermarket. I distinctly remember a friend of mine scheming to borrow and accidentally forget to return the copy his local rental shop owned. A considerable number of Tengen Tetris carts remained in circulation, but the recall and Tengen's superior spate of play options made it a hot commodity for collectors. Of course, it would eventually be eclipsed in desirability by the likes of stadium events and early low print run releases such as Stack Up and Chubby Cherub. But memory tells me that Tengen Tetris was the first NES cartridge ever to command prices above $100 among collectors, an eye-watering sum for an NES game in the 1990s. We were so young and innocent back then. And the recall certainly didn't do any favors for Tengen. The company would survive this debacle, but rather than leaping boldly into the realm of unlicensed software with a world-class release, they got off on the back foot with a financial hit that surely ran into the millions. A brutal beginning for any publisher, but especially galling in light of what should have been an absolute triumph.
Next time on NES Works Gaiden, Tengen, undeterred, ramps up the bootlegging.